in this digital age, one of the really amazing things that I have found to be helpful is finding a community in an online space. So, connecting with bloggers who may hold your same point of view or who may challenge you to think about things differently. I think because there's so many social media networks and sites that you can be connected to people who are not just in your community, that can help you build that basis of language to speak back against things that might be bothering you in your own community that you see as a problem. It can help you find that sense of community if you don't have one in your immediate geographic location. And I think it's been really vital for queer people, for people of color living in rural areas who don't have access to these large historic communities of people who look like them and have the same values and beliefs as them. So that would be one strategy. I've also mentioned a lot of theorists. So feminist theorists have been really influential. You know, I am an academic. I like to read. I love books. I love finding and thinking about ideas and finding other people who like those same kinds of things become really valuable skills. And just making sure that you have, again, the ability to create and craft that space that comes from this inclusive intentionality, right? Where people are not an afterthought. People with diverse identities are not an afterthought, but are centered, and that there are policies or practices that are put in place to create and maintain that inclusive community, and that you hold each other accountable and are willing to recognize your own mistakes and own up to them and continue the journey forward. I think it's not so much a skill, but maybe more a practice that I would hope that other people who are invested in working towards social change and social justice would be invested in those kinds of practices.
So you've talked a couple of times about creating really inclusive, like genuinely inclusive spaces. Are there experiences you've had or observations you'd want to share about how that can really work? Like if someone wants to help create that space.
Absolutely.
Share with them.
So I've mentioned a little bit already about intentionality is really important. And I think so often we live in a world of convenience. We live in a world in which we do things because other people have done them that way, and we often don't think that there's much room for innovation or doing something different. And I think oftentimes people who have diverse identities do things differently, and that shuffles around the status quo, right? And it pushes people to their limits. And sometimes, as we all know, people are not always the best to adapt to change. So I think maybe the first thing would be to be open to change. And I think that's hard, even for me sometimes. I like my routine. I like things to be a certain way. I have expectations if things are set out in a particular way. But it's also really amazing to learn about new things and to see and allow other things to take shape that might be different than what we initially thought we were going into. So that openness becomes the first site of creating that inclusive space for me. I would also say I don't think that it works when white folks or anyone who is in the privileged category get together and say, oh, but we need a person of color here. That just fundamentally does not work. There has to be a point in the conception of the group way before that point to have those inclusive values represented. And it should be from the very, very beginning, right? And I think in Minnesota, sometimes it can be very difficult to say, find someone who's different, right? But that's an excuse. And I think that that's an excuse that we've used for so long because it maintains the status quo. So for me, it's more about how do we interrupt that cycle where people in the majority category get together, they set the agenda, they set the points of what they want to have as the outcome, and then they bring a person of color in, or then they bring an LGBT person in, or, you know, so on and so on. And I think that there have to be ways that we're thinking about those things from the beginning before we get to that point where, again, someone becomes the token voice at the table who is left out of the conversation from the beginning, who at that point their voice doesn't matter because things are too set to really change them. Again, that openness becomes an important quality. And I think that that has happened so much in my life that it's very frustrating, right? It creates a community in which people who have diverse identities don't want to be there because they've been exploited in these other situations in which they were called in, they weren't heard, they tried to do what they could, but nothing really came of it. And it creates this really negative cycle where then, the people in the majority say, well, they stopped coming to meetings, or we invited them, but they didn't show up. And I think it becomes this cycle of blame, right? And it's not the fault of the people who have diverse identities. It's the fault of a structure in which we're unwilling to step outside of. And I think part of that is we all need to have a good basis for critical thinking and engaging with that intentional community from the beginning. That if we want to change our communities, we have to be reflective of the diversity within them. And so often it's an afterthought, again, because we live in a world in which it's always been an afterthought, right? So how do we get to a point in which it's not the afterthought, and modeling ourselves after groups who have purposefully crafted that community that's diverse, that has a myriad of opinions and viewpoints and perspectives, that may not be the most efficient, right, in this time-sensitive world that we live in, but absolutely can be the most productive because there's a shared goal and shared vision, and people feel tied into that from the beginning of the process.